Bob, you're a man who needs no introduction, receiving the Stan Musial Lifetime Achievement Award. To hear that was someone who you admired, a friend of yours.
Yes.
How special is this for you?
You know, Stan is one of those rare people about whom the cliche, every bit as good a person as he was an actor or this or that, a ball player, Hall of Fame ball player, Hall of Fame person, that's often just a cliche. It's 100% true when you talk about Stan. But now I'm going to take you on a detour. When you open this by saying, I need no introduction, and when you've been around as long as I have, you know, you're just kind of there in some people's living rooms for decades and decades, you would think so. But it is not uncommon, even to this day, for me to be walking down the street and someone yells out, "Good to see you, Mr. Musburger." And I'm like, "Hey, how you doing?" "Hey, how are you, Mr. Nance?" Guy comes up to me, he says, "I love you on the Masters." I've never done the Masters. You know, I just humor the guy, whatever you want to say. So, Muhammad Ali's funeral in 2016, the ceremony was delayed because there was a long funeral procession through Louisville. It was like almost like a state funeral. And so groups of us were in clusters conversing, just waiting for the service to start. And in walks Don King. You picture Don King with the hair and the American flag jacket, bombastic, and he walks in, and as he approaches the group that I'm in, for some reason he thinks he has to provide a caption for each person. So he goes, "Coach Pat Riley, straight off the pages of GQ. Sugar Ray Leonard, not a mark on him, as beautiful as a child. Katie Couric, America's sweetheart." And he turns to me and he goes, "Michael J. Fox." And I'm like, well, and Katie's like, "Well, Don, it's Bob Costas." And he's so shameless, he goes, "Bob Costas, greatest commentator in the world." So, when you say I need no introduction, I did for Don King.
You got your start right here in St. Louis
did,
at
at
KMOX.
Yeah.
You get the Stan Musial Award in the place where it all began.
Yes.
What does that mean to you, get to be back here?
The St. Louis component in this is big. You know, Stan, for all the great athletes that have been part of the history of sports in St. Louis, if you had to pick just one guy, it's Stan Musial. Being such a good person and so beloved by everyone and what he represents. But also, you know, my kids were born and raised in St. Louis. My kids root for the Blues and for the Cardinals and for Mizzou. So it's part of our lives.
1982, you covered your first World Series.
Yes.
Right here after your days at KMOX. You were on TV at that time. Was that a full circle moment?
Well, my first World Series for NBC was 1982, and it was my good fortune that it involved the Cardinals, and the series opened in St. Louis, first two games before going to Milwaukee for the middle three. And I was nervous enough hosting the World Series on NBC, but those nerves were calmed a little bit because I knew the Cardinals like the back of my hand, and Whitey Herzog was always very nice to me, and I knew Ozzie and Willie McGee. I mean, I knew them, and so that made me feel a little more confident about being able to pull it off. And you know, you hear athletes say, whether it's the World Series or the Super Bowl, "Yeah, I was nervous until the first ground ball was hit to me, and then I was just playing baseball," or the first tackle of the game, and then it was just a game. You know, even then as a young broadcaster, when the first segment before we went to commercial went okay, then I started to calm down. When the second one went okay, and the third, and eventually it was like, okay, I know what I'm doing.
You've publicly announced that you're stepping away from the baseball booth, the broadcast booth. When you talk about what baseball means to you, what's so special about the game?
Baseball has always been my favorite sport. It's not that I don't appreciate having been involved in so many others. I respect and appreciate all of it, and I have many great moments connected to each of them. But baseball was my favorite sport as a kid. You know, growing up in the late 50s and in the 60s, a younger person may not grasp this, but baseball really was the unquestioned national pastime. Nobody ever worried if a World Series game would get higher ratings than a regular season NFL game. So I just loved baseball. collecting baseball cards, you didn't collect them because of their monetary value. You collected them to flip them and trade them and put them on the spokes of your bike so it would sound cool pedaling around the neighborhood. The game had a hold on the American imagination that was different then. You had television, but it was black and white. You listened to the games on the radio. That distance added to the romance and the mythology of it. And I was always fascinated by the best baseball broadcasters. So of all the things I've done, they all have a special place, but baseball's at the top of the list.
When you were first getting your start, it was Jack Buck and Harry Carey. Those guys were the household names. Thinking back to those moments where you were listening to them, listening to your favorite baseball broadcasters around the globe, and how radio was just ingrained in the homes of families when you got your start, why was KMOX such an important place for you to get your start?
Well, it was my good fortune to land at KMOX when I was 22 years old. You want a master class in broadcasting, even if it's only by osmosis. You're around Jack Buck, and you're around Dan Kelly, who was the premier hockey announcer of his time anywhere in the United States or Canada. He was the guy. Bob Starr was the most amazing radio football announcer that I've ever been around. And then you had Bob Hardy on the news side, who in effect was the Walter Cronkite of St. Louis, and a radio genius like Jack Carney, who understood the theater of the mind that radio is as well as anyone I've ever been around. He was just a master of it. And being in proximity to those people, I don't think any good broadcaster should ever copy anyone. Maybe at the very beginning when you're just trying to get your feet wet, but you can be influenced by them. And I don't think you could have a better laboratory to create a good broadcaster than being around KMOX. And I knew when I came to KMOX, I was familiar with it because I would sit in my dad's car when I was 11, 12 years old. I wasn't going to drive it. That would be quite illegal. But I just turned the key enough to light up the dashboard, and I would fiddle with the dial during the summer to try and pull in out-of-town baseball broadcasts. And you could get Ernie Harwell on WJR in Detroit, and Bob Prince on KDKA in Pittsburgh, Chuck Thompson on WBAL in Baltimore. And on a clear night from like 800 miles away, I could hear Harry Carey and Jack Buck doing the Cardinals. And so I knew what that meant. And I knew that the Cardinals had an enormous network of more than 200 stations. And for a very long time, St. Louis was the westernmost and southernmost franchise in all of baseball. So it truly was a regional franchise. I knew what the Cardinals meant, and I knew what KMOX meant. And when I walked in the door, for me to meet Jack Buck would have been the same thing as for a young comedian to meet Johnny Carson. That's what it felt like.
Stan Musial, as well as Mickey Mantle, those are two names that are very important in your life when you think back on your baseball career. Tell me about your relationships with those two in particular, how much they meant to you.
Mickey and I became pretty good friends after he was done playing. And I interviewed him several times, and I think he became comfortable with me. And then when he passed away, his family asked that I be one of his eulogists. I think what really affected that was when he came out of the Betty Ford Clinic on one of the NBC News magazines. I interviewed him, and he had to decide between 60 Minutes and doing it with me. And 60 Minutes is the most prestigious, was and still is the most prestigious. But he trusted me, which meant a lot to me. And I think I let him, or was able to create a circumstance in which he was able to tell the story he wanted to tell. And then only a year or so after that, when he passed away, his family remembered that. And Stan Musial, because he was such a great guy, on his own, came from St. Louis to Dallas for Mickey's funeral. So he was in attendance at the funeral, and he must have liked what I said about Mantle in that setting. And he commented to his family as his days were dwindling that he would like me to do his eulogy, which was very touching. I think I had a good understanding of what baseball meant to millions of people who just didn't happen to have a microphone. And so I think a lot of my broadcasts, and certainly the eulogies, spoke for them and to them. So with Stan, I mean, I had an understanding not just of his greatness as a player or even the fact that he was a nice guy. I understood how it resonated here in St. Louis differently than it would have in most other places, and I tried to get that across in the eulogy.
29 Emmys, Baseball Hall of Fame. How special is this award for you?
You know, I've been lucky enough to receive some recognition, but the two things that matter most to me, if I had to rank them, and I appreciate them all, Baseball Hall of Fame and the Musial Award.
Why?
Well, the Frick Award for the broadcaster's wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame, that's the ultimate recognition that a baseball broadcaster and someone who loves the game who isn't a player can possibly receive. And the Musial Award, A, because it's Stan, and B, because it's St. Louis.